Thank you for tuning into the Mental Health Wealth Podcast. My name is Key Ford. I'm your host. As we always start off, we like to say that this information that is given is not to diagnose yourself, but it's to help you to seek the help that you may need if you're experiencing any of these things. On our last podcast, we were discussing anger. So I called it Anger 101. So I guess this would be Anger 101 Part 2. And this time we're going to look at the cycle and how anger can really affect us and how it can affect our lives, and the cycle, if we don't break it, that we'll continue to do the same thing. You know, it is the case that if we do something repeatedly and we expect to get different results, but we're doing the same thing, there's something wrong with that frame of thinking. If our anger, again, gets us to a point where we are so riled up that we are losing our friends, our family, our jobs, we can't focus. If we are in those positions, we need to, again, examine ourselves to see exactly what's really under the bottom. What is under the surface that causes us to feel this way? And when anger is that intense and we're losing things, it needs to be broken up. So again, one of the things that I've pulled today is dealing with the cycle of anger, because there is a cycle. When we look at anger, anger starts with a triggering event. It goes to negative thoughts, and then it will go to the emotional response because we are emotional people. And then there are physical symptoms, and then there's a behavior response. And so they continue to go, and it's this circle that it continues to go in. And so it is that cycle that I want to talk about today, because the anger cycle can also lead to several other cycles, but we'll look at just these two for today. Because again, remember, there's nothing wrong with being angry. Again, the Bible says, Ephesians chapter 4 and 26, be angry and sin not. So I don't need to let it be the part where I'm so angry that I commit sin, or as the end of the verse says, and let not the sun go down upon thy wrath. So it is a good thing that we work out our anger, that we find ways to change. But let's deal with the cycle first. Again, the first thing that I mentioned, we see the triggering event. It is important for us to know what our triggers are. A trigger is something that will set you off easily. There are many people who are triggered by a lot of different things, especially in this world that we live in today of social media. There are so many things that you may see that are triggering. You know, for somebody, this podcast may be triggering. They may turn it on and say, well, you know what? I don't like the sound of his voice. Or I don't like the information that he's telling. Or they may be triggered by the fact of saying that anger is a bad thing when it has gotten to this point of that is making your life just miserable and you're losing everything. So it could be that point that can trigger somebody. There are many things that trigger people. And again, we have to know what triggers us. Now, everybody who knows me knows that I like social media, but if social media was to leave, it wouldn't affect my life any, because there are so many things that happen on social media. And a book that I would definitely recommend to people, I think I recommended it on the introduction podcast, but there's a book by Cal Newport called Digital Minimalism. And he talks about how in the future that social media platforms will come with a warning label, like a pack of cigarettes. And it's amazing that that's the road that we're going down right now, because social media leads to a lot of anxiety, depression, anger, and all these different issues. So it's one of those things that we have to realize. If social media is something that angers us because we get on and we see somebody have a difference of opinion or something like that, we may need to remove ourselves from that platform or from those platforms, because people are going to be on there and people are going to express opinions. People are going to be talking. And if that is a big trigger for you, you have to remove yourself from that situation. Now, again, I'm not just picking on social media, but anything that triggers you. A trigger can be a sound, a trigger can be a person, a trigger can be a situation, a place, a smell, anything. I say this as a joke, because where I grew up at, my mom, and I hope she don't listen to this episode, I hope she don't listen to this part and think I'm just just such a bad child. But my mother made beef stroganoff all the time when we were staying in the projects. And I can remember her, like, it seemed like if it was every other day or so, like we had beef stroganoff. So to this day, I do not like beef stroganoff. If I smell beef stroganoff, I become very angry. Now, of course, I'm not angry enough to go and fight somebody, or I'm not angry enough to cause problems, but it takes me back when I smell it. I'm like, I grew up on this and I got tired. Like we ate it so much that even as a kid, I would get in trouble because I refused to eat it. You know, things can be triggering, but when we think about the triggers and we think about the anger cycle, again, the first thing that I mentioned is the triggering event. And just by way of information, we can't be people who say, well, that shouldn't trigger you. You shouldn't be triggered because of that. You know, that's like saying to a person who has been through a life changing event, just suck it up. That's not how we handle somebody who has a situation where they've been through a life changing event. Again, you hear me speak so much about the fact of foster care because again, that's the field that I deal in. And we can even take it further to people who I have counseled inside the church, because there are many people who have experienced trauma and may feel like, hey, as a Christian, I'm not supposed to go through these things. Well, you know what? Triggering events happen to Christians and people who don't profess to be of the same faith. It can happen to anybody. None of us are excused from events or things that can trigger us. And so, again, whether it be place, person, smell, an event, anything, it can happen. So, what happens when this event occurs? I make sure I always like to keep my notes together and make sure I run my thoughts together. And I'm transparent like that because everything is not just going to be in my head, but I want to make sure that I don't forget important things. So I made an example of saying an event or situation triggers a person, and what happens if anybody knows driving in Nashville or driving in Memphis or driving in any big city, and especially like a big city like Atlanta or something, you know, what happens when somebody jumps in front of you and all of a sudden you have to slam on your brakes and you spill your coffee and you almost hit the person in front of you and all these things happen. Well, you know what? You may be a little reluctant or a little hesitant to get back into that traffic, or it may make you feel a certain type of way. And next thing you know, now you're not going to let anybody over. Now you're being very watchful because now you're angry because of all the events that have transpired. Now, that may happen to some people. Now, does that mean that you should find the person who got in front of you, have some words with them, and try to get into a confrontation? No, it shouldn't be the case. What about having a bad day at work? You know, sometimes people have bad days at work. Sometimes your computer may not work. Sometimes a coworker may get on your nerves. Anything can happen. But should that be a reason for us to just be so angry that we hurt somebody? Now, let's look at a triggering event as in the fact of somebody who was beaten or a rape victim. Let's use that example. A person who has been through such a terrible tragedy like that, and so they may see a person and they may clench their purse a little bit tighter, or they may clench to the person who they're walking with because they're reminded of somebody. That's a real tragic event. That is something that has happened. But let's look at it from the anger standpoint again. Should I be so mad that somebody cut me off in traffic that I pull a gun on them? Let's say that I do that. Let's say that I pull a gun out on somebody. Now, the negative thought is me it has gotten me to the point where I pull a gun out. I become irrational in my thinking because you cut me off in traffic. Now I'm going to confront you and I'm going to make you pay for what you did. Now, question, what does the gun have to do with it? Why would you pull a gun on somebody? Because they jumped out in front of you, because they passed you. Now, it's sad to say that I want to say it may have been 2018 in Memphis. I can remember a report came out that some young men were driving on the highway, and it was three young men in the car, and they got mad because a person jumped in front of them. Well, they shot and they got up to the car and they shot the car and they actually killed the person who was driving. All three young men were charged in that situation. You should never act off of those irrational thoughts. That irrational thinking will cause a problem every time because it's you're not in your right mind. And that's what anger does again. When your brain, your amygdala is hijacked, that cortisol is going, and now you are responding in a way that is not rational. That's what anger does. So the triggering event that happens can make a person have these negative thoughts. Again, negative thoughts can range from so many different from so high to so low. But again, in the situation we're dealing with a person who has cut you off in traffic. Now, again, I'm pretty sure all of us have driven in places that have terrible traffic, and things like that may happen that somebody jumps out in front of you. But it shouldn't be the case that we harm somebody. So again, the triggering event, the negative thought, and again, the emotional response. Again, negative thoughts lead to negative emotions, even if the thoughts are irrational. Well, what do you mean by that? Feeling of shame or guilt or feeling of that anger that somebody did that thing to you because of who you are, and now you have to take vengeance. It has to be broken. Now, there can also be physical symptoms. When you are in that moment, again, we're dealing with the moment of somebody pulling out in front of you and you're angry. Now, your body can get hot. Your face can get hot. Your whole body can get hot because of the fact of, hey, this just happened. I think I'm about to lose my life. Something just terrible just happened to me, and now I have to react. Your stomach could start hurting. You could feel nauseous. All these things. That's what anger does again, because the cortisol is going through your body. Your amygdala has been hijacked. You are now operating in a fight or flight situation, even though you may not perceive yourself to be in an immediate danger, but now the autopilot has kicked in, and now you're either ready to fight or you're ready to get yourself out of that situation. And then the behavior response. Again, you get pulled over, you get interrupted while driving, you pull a gun, and now what are you gonna do? What good is pulling the gun or even cursing at somebody? What good does that do? You're still angry. You haven't taken time to calm down and process things, and now this is where you've led to. Now, because of anger, you've pulled a gun on someone on an interstate. Police has now come. God forbid that you have shot at the person or done something or hit them with the gun, and now you're risking legal trouble, all because you're angry about something. Now you may say, Key, well, why would you even talk about this? Why would you even make this a point? Because again, we have to get ourselves under control. I can't control what other people do, but I can control what I do. I liken it to when we parent. You know, it's a lot easier to calm your children down when you're calm yourself. So in any situation where you're angry, it's a lot better for you to calm yourself down and deal with your emotions before you deal with somebody else. It's just like when you're flying. And if they say, hey, the plane is losing cabin pressure, you're supposed to put your mask on first before you tend to the needs of someone else. And so in these situations, if this continues to be the cycle of anger, if we don't break these cycles, guess what? Every time we do that behavior response, we'll go back into another triggering event. We're going to continue to act the same way every time. We won't change, and it'll be a big problem, and we'll stay in trouble. We'll yell, we'll fuss. Some people will even curse. Some people will take it to the extent of physically harming somebody. So that's what happens in the cycle of anger. Again, the triggering event, the negative thoughts, the emotional response, the physical symptoms, and then also the very last part, the behavior response. Anger is something that needs to be checked because sometimes we can do things being vengeful and spiteful because we're angry, being caught up in that very moment. Now we looked at it just from kind of an out there example of the being in a car and getting somebody jumping in front of you. But I want to show you how if we don't fix the anger cycle, what happens when it comes to our relationships. Now, the cycle of abuse. I want you to see how anger and abuse can go hand in hand. And again, this podcast is to shed light. It's not to shame anyone. It's not to make anyone, it's not to make any, not to highlight any group of people. This is for all of us to examine ourselves. If you are dealing with abuse, if you are in an abusive relationship, whether you be male or female, you need to make those things known. You need to seek help. You don't need to continue to go through those things. I know so often we'll say, oh, the personal change. Well, sometimes people don't know how to change. And when a person refuses therapy and when a person refuses to deal with the things that are causing them to be this way, we have to ask ourselves, what's more important, our physical safety or our relationship with said person? Maybe you leaving said person will cause them to go and seek the help that they need. And so it's important that we realize that how far anger can go. I mentioned on on the Anger 101 episode 1 about how domestic violence rises, especially in cohabiting relationships. It also happens in marriages and also just relationships in general. But I want to show you how the cycle of abuse goes because of anger. Now, the first thing that it starts with tension building. If I'm a person who doesn't know how to control my anger in the first place, and you do something to make me mad, and I'm the tension is already building, I'm a time bomb waiting to explode. And so often again, it is the case that people may not know. They may not see you as the time bomb. They may not know that they're only seconds away from detonation. They may see you getting angry, but they may not think, oh, it's not such a big deal. But in the person's mind who is actually angry, it is a very big deal. So when tension builds, when stress begins to grow, when a situation begins to get the best of a person, you don't know how a person will react sometimes. And so if I'm a person who is struggling with my anger, if I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do, if I've not done the work on myself, if I'm not able to show my anger in a constructive way instead of a destructive way, I'm going to be one that when I get ready to release it, I'm going to let whoever have it, whoever's nearest me, whoever is near to me, whoever is in my path, I'm going to let them have it. So as tension builds, stress grows, and the threat becomes more imminent. Made the comment, the victim may attempt to reduce tension by complying with the abuser. Don't put yourself in a situation where that's what you have to do. You notice they've gotten mad and now you're in a point where you can't leave. And now you are starting to try to communicate and say, well, maybe if I do this, they'll let me go. Maybe if I do that. So when tension builds, there's an abusive incident that takes place. I didn't look up the stats for last year, but I know when I looked it up in 2019, actually 2020 also, the numbers were staggering when it came to how many couples or how many men and women or what percentage had admitted to being physically abused by their partners because of their anger. It could the abusive incident can be verbal and it could be physical. Or it could be sexual, I should say. A lot of times people don't view verbal as abuse. Verbal abuse is just as much abuse as physical or sexual abuse. It is something that comes from a place of anger, and it is something that is used to control said person. So when it comes to these forms of abuse, these intimidation tactics are something that stem from anger and can keep a person in a situation that they don't need to be in. So you have the tension that builds, you have the abusive incident, and then you know what happens after that? You go to the honeymoon phase. Well, baby, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. You know I love you. You know I can't live without you. You know that wasn't me. You know I'll never do it again. You just please give me one more chance. Now, I'm not saying that that a person can't change, but for people who don't do the work on themselves, and for people who are struggling really, really bad with these anger issues, and then not only with the anger issues, then they put the maladaptive behaviors such as smoking, drinking, opioids, all these things, when they bring all these things into play, it's going to be hard for a person to really get the help they need to get and be the person that they need to be. And so now you have the honeymoon phase. Now, again, as you heard me say, the honeymoon phase, the abuser apologizes, shows remorse, and often begs for forgiveness. They may shower the victim with love and affection and promise that the abuse will never happen again, but it's only temporary. It doesn't last forever, because the moment when that trigger comes back again, when that triggering event shows back up, that moment when they look on Facebook and see that the love of their life has liked another man's post, or they have done something that they don't agree with, guess what? The event is going to start back up again. So you have the tension that builds, you have the abusive incident, you have the honeymoon period, and then you're going to have the calm part of the relationship. The calm is going to be everything's back to normal for a moment until, again, that tension builds back up. So we see how anger can be a destructive thing. We see how anger can get to the point where it just sends somebody in a complete rage. And it's sad to say that many people experience that, and they're suffering in silence. Again, I'll say it until I'm blue in the face, or I'll say it until as long as I have breath in my body. I do not encourage anyone to stay in a relationship where there is abuse. If there, and I know this is a podcast that speaks strictly from a Christian perspective. Even if it's in a marriage, now you can't go out and just go and get you another spouse. That's something you may have to separate for a little while. 1 Corinthians 7 talks about separating for a little while. Maybe that person will get the help that they need, but you need to be alive to see that person get that help. If you're being abused by somebody who is taking their anger out, and it's something that is very detrimental to your growth as a Christian or just your life in general, if you are stuck inside this abuse cycle with somebody who is on that angry cycle, you need to seek help. I bet when I I should say it this way, when I was thinking about the way to present this information, I kept going back and forth with myself, like, what do I say? How do I say it? Do I really want to put this in? But I think I would do a disservice if I didn't put the information out this way and be this blunt with it. That we have to really evaluate ourselves, because again, I'm 36 years of age as of a few days ago, and I have children. I have 2 daughters, and I don't want to just make it about my daughters, but I have 2 daughters and I have 5 sons, and I don't want any of them to be in a relationship, and I don't want them to be the abuser or the one that's being abused. And so it's important that we talk about these things and that we examine ourselves, because if we're stuck in these cycles, it doesn't do us any good. So one of the things that I want to talk about before we end this and then go and we go a little bit further, how do we know the triggers? How do we know that something will become a trigger or can become a trigger? Where, again, that's when knowing yourself comes into play. Have you been abused in your past? Have you been spoken to ill in your past by a family member? Have you been molested by somebody who has done these things? A lot of times people act out the things that have been done to them. So it's no surprise when you see somebody who is terrified of being in a relationship, because they have experienced bad relationships from the people who's supposed to love them. It is very crucial to look at those situations like that. Think about how that sounds. The person who loves me and who's supposed to love me the most is the person who's actually hurting me. So again, sometimes parents are triggers for kids. Sometimes it may be a family member. Again, we've discussed this already. It could be a person or a place. I know, for an example, of course, HIPAA will not allow me to say the name, and I wouldn't say the name anyway. But I think about a child that I had done therapy with some time ago, and sad situation, very very sad situation, that the little girl said to me, "Well, my mommy used to put me in the trunk when I wouldn't eat my food." And so the girl was having problems, and she would hoard food. And the parents would ask me, "Well, Key, what's wrong? Like, how, what do we do about this?" Well, again, we had to find out exactly what was going on with her. We had to explore the trauma and realize why the girl was being so angry and why things were going like they were going. Because again, this is what she was experiencing. Her mother was full of anger. And so she would take that same anger and now project it on the kids. And now the kids project that same anger to those who they're around. And so the girl was hoarding food. The girl was hurting other children. It was just a very, very bad situation. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about on this podcast is cognitive behavior therapy. And that's what I was able to do with her. But I was able to do trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. And a part of that the trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, or TFCBT, is that there's a thing called a trauma narrative. And before you get to the trauma narrative, you go through psychoeducation, relaxation. You build up the client to be able to receive those things. And so by the time we got to the trauma narrative, where she was able to write out the things that happened to her, and it was all about anger. And everything she wrote was about anger, and how her anger that she had was not her fault, that she learned it from her mother. She learned it from her mother because that's all her mother did. Her mother was a very angry person, and she starved them and all these things. They would be locked in closets and stuff for a long time because the mom was angry that her boyfriend would not treat her a certain way. And that's what these kids had to deal with. Now, I'm not telling you these stories to make you sad. I'm telling you these stories to bring awareness that we're going to pass down to another generation what we have been doing. If we have been people who have been a victim of this cycle, we should want to break the cycle and want to be able to start a new generation of doing better, being more in tune with themselves, and being able to handle their anger in a constructive way. If not, history will continue to repeat itself. We'll have more children in foster care. We'll have more broken homes. We'll have more chaos and confusion. In the state of Tennessee right now, as of last week, there are 9,117 kids in state's custody. A lot of that is due to angry parents who had been hurt before in their past, who had not reconciled with their own selves how to get out of their cycle. I hope this is insightful, and I hope you continue to come back and listen more with us. Anything we talk about on this podcast is for your knowledge. This is not information that I'm not diagnosing anyone, but I hope that the conversation opens up to where, again, we can all seek to improve our own mental health.